Hello. I see I have one person that's joined me, so that's great. Otherwise, we will be recording for everyone else that is, watching later on. So I'll just going to arrange a couple things. Hi, Christina. Are you able to hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So we will go into the circulatory system. And for the interest of, making a Skype session not terribly long, I think we will just do Skype for the circulatory system, and then I will record a separate video for the immune system. But Christina, if you have any questions on the immune system, feel free to ask while I'm here, okay?
Okay.
All right, so circulatory system. So test number 1, I feel like you guys all did pretty well. Some of you may find test number 2 a little trickier because I do find that some students, have a bit of a difficult time with the immune system. Sometimes I feel like your book this is the one part in your textbook that I feel it could complicate things just slightly, but hopefully you guys will all be just as successful in test number 2 as you were in test number 1. So I was pretty impressed with a lot of the grades that happened there. So I don't think we need to review Skype necessarily because I think my one participant right now is fine with Skype. And for all of you watching this as a recording, it won't matter. All right, so chapter objectives. So you'll also find this kind of study guide in our D2L. So I will post a direct link to that if you're having trouble finding it. But I believe the study guide is posted at the end of Unit 3 in the resources, if I remember correctly. So it does... Hi, Rowan. That's okay. It's okay if you're late. So you can find that study guide there for test 2, which will include this unit that you guys are working through right now. So I hope most of you are starting to work through this unit. I know sometimes after doing a test and all the work for Unit 1 and 2, it can be a bit overwhelming to think about going on into Unit 3, but since we are fast-tracked, it is important to try to log in daily, try to do a little bit of work at a time, so it doesn't feel so overwhelming right before due dates. So just a reminder that Unit 3 is due at the end of the day on Saturday the 7th. So one thing your book starts by talking about is athletic endurance. So this relates to the circulatory system, and sometimes it helps to understand how it all works, because people that train athletically are essentially increasing their body's ability to get more oxygen delivered to their muscles and to have more carbon dioxide removed. So one thing that happens there is as you're training, your body actually starts to get used to your muscles needing that extra blood flow, and you can create more red blood cells than some people that don't exercise get. So that's on page 495 in your textbook, and it gives a cool way of understanding some of it. So to bring us back to kind of what brings all animals together as far as circulation goes. So every organism that's living needs to be able to exchange materials. So we talked about this in one of the other units. So they need to be able to diffuse across their cells. So nutrients, oxygen, carbon dioxide, those things have to diffuse. And there's some kind of circulatory system. So it's very complex, and something like a human, it's going to be not that complex. It's really just going across cell membrane, and something that's really simple. So, but they do require those two things. So humans are going to be a closed circulatory system, so we'll talk about that. The other part of it is invertebrates often have an open circulatory system, so just to touch on it a bit. So both are going to have some kind of pump, usually called a heart. Both are going to have a fluid that circulates among the cells. The difference being that, let me grab a pen here, that something like a grasshopper is the example given here. He's going to have blood vessels that are open. So if this were his heart pumping blood, those blood vessels are eventually going to be open, and then this fluid will circulate freely around the body and around cells, and then eventually will kind of make its way back into that pump to get circulated a second time. So thankfully humans aren't this way, because it would be very inefficient for us if our blood was just randomly. In fact, that's a bad thing. If we're in an accident or have bruising, our blood vessels are damaged and blood is allowed to freely flow where it shouldn't. That's very bad for humans. So thankfully we've evolved to have the closed circulatory system rather than this style of open. So just a reminder that the only thing, the difference here, the real difference between open and closed, is that open has these blood vessels that are open-ended. And so this fish is an example of a closed circulatory system, the same as humans would be considered a closed circulatory system. There's still some differences, obviously, between a fish and humans, but the blood or the circulating fluid stays all within these tubes, so there's never a time on purpose that this fluid leaves the tubing system here. And there's also the distinction that these types of creatures that have this closed circulatory system has interstitial fluids. So while blood is flowing through the vessels, there's also this other fluid that's actually around all of our cells that's going to exchange with the blood. Okay, so the human cardiovascular system. So these are the three main parts we're going to touch on. So the central pump, so that's obviously our heart. The vascular system, so there are several different structures we're going to talk about in the vascular system. And please stop me or write over in the chat box if you have any questions at all, okay? Or if you want me to describe something in a different way. And then the third part of our cardiovascular system is the circulating fluid, so that's blood for us. And anytime you see these diagrams, something to keep in mind is when they are making something blue, that denotes oxygen-poor blood. And whenever they are showing vessels that are red, that is going to denote oxygen-rich blood. So just something to keep in mind looking at these diagrams. So question number 1, so if you wanted to answer over in the chat box or unmute your mics, you can answer, or you can even grab, there's a pen up in the top corner of your slide, there should be, you can even circle one if you like. So which of the 3 types of vessels are responsible for exchange? So if you've already read through some of your book or done any of your Mastering Biology assignments, there's one type of blood vessel where things are going to be exchanged. So oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, minerals like sodium. So Rowan said C, and that is correct. So that's where things are going to be exchanged. And this diagram is in your book, and it gives kind of, I think it is, I'm pretty sure, gives a simplified version of what we were talking about. Oh yes, it's on page 501. So it's showing how arteries are always coming away from the heart. So in general, have oxygen-rich blood. There is one artery that doesn't have oxygen-rich blood. So we'll touch on that later. So the oxygen-rich blood's making its way to all these capillary beds. So it's important to remember that these capillaries are all over your body. So all of our cells are relatively close to these capillary beds, otherwise they wouldn't get nutrients, oxygen, they wouldn't be able to get rid of their carbon dioxide. So you're going to find these in your feet, near your muscles, you're going to find them in your fingertips, your kidneys, your lungs. You'll find these capillary beds all over. So it's showing that this is where blood turns from high O2 and then goes through the capillary beds, and then afterwards becomes low O2. And then it's going back into the veins. So veins are different from arteries in one way because veins are always bringing blood back to the heart. And so because veins are a little bit further away from the heart than arteries, they need some special functions to be able to get blood back. Especially, or you may have noticed if you stand on your feet a lot during the day, some people may end up with some swelling in your feet, or your legs might feel really tired. So part of that reason is your body has to work hard to work against gravity and get that blood back up to your heart. So veins have a couple of ways that it helps. So they have these valves inside, right here and right here, so that when blood does move forward, it's prevented from moving back because of these valves. So that's one way. And then also when your muscles move, so your skeletal muscles, so for example, say your calf muscles in the bottom part of your leg, when they move, they're actually kind of pressing on the veins, and that helps squeeze blood back up where it belongs. So when people tell you, if you've been sitting for a long time, to get up and move around, it helps with your circulation, it really does. It helps to squeeze blood back up into the veins. Okay, so blood leaving the heart would flow from. So if blood is leaving the heart, what is it going to meet first? So again, you can answer over in the chat if you like, or use the pen feature, or your microphone. Any ideas? A, that is correct. So I always remember if it's arteries or veins leaving the heart. One way I remember is arteries start with A and away starts with A as well. So arteries go away from the heart. So if blood is leaving the heart, it's moving away from it. So the first thing it's going to encounter are arteries. And then we'll go through the rest of these in a bit. I've also created a second kind of short video in case you just want to follow the flow of blood. So it's less than 10 minutes, so sometimes that's easier to go through than a whole Skype session to find what you want. So I'll post that along with this video. So this diagram is in your textbook, and I kind of like it because it goes step by step through things. Let me see here. No, I don't. I thought I had a different one, but I don't see it there. So you can think of capillaries maybe being up here somewhere. So say these are in your kidneys maybe. So blood's coming back, or actually this is the top part of the body, so let's say these capillaries are in the end of your nose. Blood's going to come back to the heart, so it always enters into the right side of the heart. So this is the right side because you have to think about this heart as if it were in somebody that you're looking at. So that's why this is the right side and this is the left side. So blood always comes back to the heart into the right side. It comes back into the right atrium, then it's into the right ventricle, then it's pumped up into these guys right up here. And so this is your tricky artery that actually this is a pulmonary artery, and this is the one that has low oxygen. So this is the one artery you're going to find that has low oxygen. And I go over this again in the shorter video I made if you want to watch it over again. So from here, these pulmonary arteries, we're going into the left lung and the right lung. And now we're going back into the heart. So now in the lungs, you've picked up oxygen, so now we have red arrows happening here. And we're going into the left atrium. Number 5, the left ventricle. So this left ventricle, he's going to be the most powerful because he needs to pump out to the rest of the body. So he needs enough force to get blood where it needs to go all throughout your body. And that's through this largest artery in your body, the aorta. And then out to the rest of your body and back to eventually get to all these capillaries again. I left this blank here because I was going to go through that again, but I already did it in a second video, so it's easier to find. Okay, so blood route through the heart. So blood makes it back to the heart. Which of these would be the pathway it takes? Anybody want to guess? So what we just reviewed in the heart. So when blood's always coming back from the body, it's always going to enter into the right side of the heart first. So by that we know it's A or C, right? So the answer, so I have people that have guessed C. The answer is actually A because you're going from the right atrium, so you're coming into the heart on the right side. The right atrium, which is the smaller first chamber it meets, the atrium pumps blood into the right ventricle, so that's the bigger chamber on the right side. And then we're going to the lungs to pick up oxygen. And from there it's coming back into the left side of the heart out to the body. If you answered C, so it starts off correct, right atrium to the right ventricle, but then it's going out to the aorta, which is that largest artery in the aorta is this guy right here, this largest artery in the human body. That's actually after the left side of the heart. Okay, so part of like how the body works has to do, or sorry, how the heart works has to do with these two terms called systole and diastole. So these two words are kind of representing the blood pressure that happens that enables blood to flow throughout the body. So blood pressure. So say we have a blood pressure of 120/80, which is a very, kind of standard average. So a lot of people are familiar with, hey, what's your blood pressure? Oh, it was 120/80. They're familiar with using those numbers, but not necessarily familiar with what do those numbers actually mean. So 120 and 80, both of these are actually followed by something called millimeters of mercury. Sorry, my terrible writing with my mouse. So these numbers actually denote the amount of pressure that's in your arteries. So this top one, if you'll notice, is always higher than the bottom number. So what this means is the top number is actually the systolic cycle of the heart over here. So over here would be the 120 number. And this systole is when your heart is actually contracting. So when your heart pumps, so those atrium and ventricles, one after the other, are contracting to pump blood out. It's actually making blood move and creating more pressure in your arteries. So the bottom number, 80, is known as diastole, or the diastolic kind of cycle of your heart. So this is when your heart is just relaxed. So it's important that your heart relaxes because that's when it's given the opportunity to refill with blood before it pumps again. I feel silly. I'm sitting here making hand motions as if you can see my hand motions. So systole is the top number, and that's when your heart is contracting. So it's creating that force to really pump blood around your body. And diastole is when your heart is relaxing and allowing blood to flow back into your heart. Okay. Let's move along. Any questions about that? So this 120 up here is systole, down here is diastole. Okay, so we already mentioned that optimal blood pressure for an adult is 120/80. So when someone is considered to have high blood pressure, so over time, your healthcare professional may check your blood pressure, and if you're having kind of high readings over a period of time, they don't usually base it off of just one reading, because stress or being anxious can increase your blood pressure temporarily, which sometimes happens for folks when they're in their doctor's office. But if you consistently have kind of higher than normal readings, then you're going to be considered to have hypertension, which is another word for high blood pressure. So if you have a persistent, so systolic, remember, is that top number when your heart is contracting. So if you consistently have a systolic blood pressure over 140, and a diastolic, so that's when your heart is actually relaxed, that pressure in your arteries is higher than 90, you may be considered to have hypertension. So the answer to this question is actually A. The opposite of that is hypotension. So some people, especially young people sometimes suffer from hypotension. So that means your blood pressure actually is pretty consistently low. So you may have trouble, if you get up too quick in the morning, you can actually feel really faint on a regular basis. So that's having blood pressure that's too low, would be hypo. Okay, so one part that's just a minor thing to mention and think about. So when we were looking at that heart diagram, so let's just flip back here for a second. In between your chambers of your heart, there are these valves, and also, on the way into your pulmonary artery, there's a valve. In between your ventricle and your aorta is another valve, and right here in between your left atrium and left ventricle, you have another valve. So the purpose of these valves is so that blood flows in one direction, because when your ventricle over here, for example, contracts, you want all of that blood to be going in this direction. You don't want it to be going backwards where it doesn't belong. Same with any of these valves. You want blood to always be flowing in one direction, not backwards. So if you or someone you know, or maybe as a baby, you had a heart murmur is actually these valves in the heart not quite working correctly. So sometimes they might be really stiff, sometimes there could be like nerve things happening or different reasons why those valves aren't working correctly, and it creates an extra noise. So if you were to listen to someone's heart that has a heart murmur, you might hear these extra little swishing sounds happening, and it means that blood is flowing really tight through a valve, or it's backflowing where it's not supposed to. So valves are often the culprit there. So what makes your heart pump? So if you remember back to tissues, heart muscle is made up of its own kind of cardiac muscle tissue, and all of our muscles they will contract because of nerve signals that are happening. So a nerve signal that allows our heart to contract is actually this tiny bundle of nerves here in our right atrium. It's kind of found there. Sorry, that is the worst arrow ever. But it's called the SA node. So it's kind of like the natural pacemaker of our heart. So that SA node gives off electrical signals at a regular interval that causes, signals to go throughout your heart muscle to make it contract. So first that electrical impulse goes through the atria, so those two smaller chambers of the heart that pump into the ventricles. And then that impulse will actually hit the second node here that causes the electrical impulse to make the ventricles contract. So when this SA node, this pacemaker of our heart, isn't working correctly, you may have irregular heartbeats or your heart's not pumping as effectively, and so some folks end up with an artificial pacemaker. So if you know anyone that has one of those, this one is one that's actually implanted underneath someone's skin, and it has wires that lead to that SA node and kind of artificially reminds the heart that it needs to go, so that you're pumping more effectively and your cells aren't getting deprived of oxygen. So at that first slide, I think we missed most of it, but so one heartbeat is considered one like cardiac cycle, and that's that. If you ever listen to your own heart, it almost sounds like a lub-dub sound. The lub being the contraction of the atria together, and then the dub being the contraction of your ventricles happening together. So one of those is considered one kind of beat. So if you're feeling your pulse, so I don't know if many of you have done your pulse rate lab yet, but some of you may have had a pulse below 70. Some of you may have had between 70 and 80. Some of you may have been above 80. B for you, Christina. So one way of thinking of our circulation system is kind of dividing it up into two loops. So humans are, complicated, so our bodies are complicated, so we need to kind of keep the blood that's high oxygen separated from the blood that's low oxygen so that we are more efficient. And so this side is showing, so I have a question down here, which of these diagrams illustrates pulmonary circulation? So pulmonary is another word that's associated with your lungs. So this loop, that's right, the left-sided diagram would be the pulmonary circulation. So the part of the circulation that's actually looping blood into our lungs, so again, pulmonary means lungs. And so that's this side of the diagram. It's actually going through the lungs to pick up oxygen, so that's considered pulmonary. The other side over here is considered systemic. So systemic circuit is actually transporting blood from the heart to the rest of the body. So systemic is a way of thinking of the whole body. This diagram in your textbook might be useful for studying. So it's showing, you can pick a capillary anywhere in the body and kind of be able to follow the path. So here, this diagram is actually starting as if you're picking a blood cell starting in the right side of the heart right here, and then you can follow it. So it's one useful diagram that I like. And I kind of talked this through in that second video I made, so I'll leave it there. This is an up close of a capillary, so how teeny tiny a capillary is in your body is that one single red blood cell can barely squeeze through, and the walls are very thin, so there's lots of opportunity for things to pass through those to the cells of our body into that interstitial fluid where it can be picked up. So that includes oxygen that's going to go back and forth, carbon dioxide, nutrients. So these capillaries are where all of that exchange happens, which is an important point to remember. All right, so these three things are kind of what makes up the cellular component of our blood. So which one of these is responsible for disease fighting? B, that's right. So if you've read into our immune system unit, yes, B, that's right. So red blood cells are more responsible for carrying your oxygen and carbon dioxide around. White blood cells are responsible for disease fighting. And platelets with this other little protein here called fibrin or fibrinogen, that's what clots blood. So if you have a breach in your blood vessels, if you've cut yourself, it's these platelets and fibrin that work hard to create that clot that stops the blood flow from happening. This is just a diagram that shows like what makes up your blood. So if you have your blood taken at you know, the lab, it looks like this. It looks red, but what's it's actually made up of looks more like this. If you were to spin a blood sample in a centrifuge, so that spins it out really fast, it will separate into something that looks like this. So a little over half is considered plasma. So plasma is mostly water, but also there's some dissolved things in there like sodium and some nutrients. Then we have some white blood cells and platelets, so it makes up the smallest amount in your blood. Although when you're sick, this amount of white blood cells will actually increase some. And then the rest is your red blood cells. So a little over half is plasma, and a little under half is made up of your cells. That's just another diagram that shows that. So so kind of like the ending part of your chapter has to do with some diseases that are happening in this body system. So leukemia being one of them. So this talks about, so it's kind of like an overgrowth or an overproduction of white blood cells. So they're kind of growing out of control, and that means other cells aren't being produced properly. So one way that this is actually being treated is stem cells. So you may have heard stem cells being talked about in various forms in the media. But a stem cell is essentially a cell that you can find in various parts of the body that doesn't yet have a role. So it's kind of like a blank slate that can be used to create all kinds of different cells if it's treated to the right hormone, the right proteins. It can evolve into a cell. So they use stem cells. So first they kind of get rid of, you know, in this case bone marrow, which is where the white blood cells are created. So they get rid of that bone marrow that's not creating, or those cells that are not creating the proper number of white blood cells, and then they replace it with stem cells, which they hope will evolve into, you know, a working system again. Kind of reboots the system almost. So stem cells, they're you know, testing them out in all kinds of different areas. So they're trying to get them to, so these blank slate cells, they may be able to change them into liver cells. So there's all kinds of research around this. Maybe red blood cells, new nerve cells. It's a big one for people with spinal cord injuries, using stem cells to create new connections there. So cardiovascular disease. So we talk about heart attack, which is essentially a blood vessel that's actually supplying blood directly to your heart muscle, gets a blockage, and so a piece of your heart muscle will die. Stroke, that's, you know, when you know, a blood clot or there's some kind of abruption in a blood vessel is creating, you know, causing other blood tissue to die, sometimes in the brain, for example. So this cardiovascular disease is kind of just an overarching name for all diseases that are going to affect your heart and blood vessels around your body. Atherosclerosis is another example of that. So that's, you know, your arteries getting blocked by plaques, which is made up of, you know, fats and other things that start to create blockages happening in your body. So approximately 70,000 people die each year from cardiovascular diseases, 50,000 from stroke, so it is a very common, it's you know, the number 2 and number 3 leading cause of death in Canada. And it's a growing kind of epidemic as obesity increases. This is an example of what plaque might look like in a artery. So it's partially blocking, so blood has to, you know, your heart has to work harder in order to get blood flow adequately through this artery compared to this one. So these are generally taken from the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, so ways to, you know, reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease, so not smoking, knowing your cholesterol levels, for example, you know, keeping a good eye on your blood pressure, exercising regularly, eating healthy, trying to maintain a healthy weight. Managing diabetes, so having diabetes alone increases your risk for cardiovascular disease. So we'll talk about diabetes a bit more in our endocrine system, but it does increase your risks. Signs of stroke, so from Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, and there's one more that they use for this now. It's actually the tongue, oddly enough. So face is your, you know, do you have kind of a droop to one side of your face? If someone asks you to raise your arms, are you able to raise one as well as the other? Speech, is it slurred or jumbled? Are you making sense when you're talking? And then the other sign that they're talking about now is tongue. So if someone asks you to stick your tongue out, and if the tongue is going off to one side, that shows that there could be some kind of stroke happening. So that means that a blood vessel has been disrupted in some way, that's bringing blood to your brain. So a piece of your brain is affected and starting to die off, not getting enough oxygen. So it can create all of these asymmetrical symptoms happening in your body. So usually one side of the body. So if a stroke is on, say, your right side of your brain, usually your left side of the body will have these symptoms of weakness. So if we're bringing it back to homeostasis, can any of you think of an example of how our cardiovascular system contributes to homeostasis? Blood pressure is oxygen intake, that's right. So if your body is needing more oxygen because you're exercising or whatnot, our cardiovascular system works hard to, you know, increases our pulse rate, as you may have noticed in our pulse rate lab. So our heart works a little harder to get more blood and oxygen to your muscles. That's a great one. Another one we did talk about, or did we talk about it? I don't remember exactly. Did we talk about thermoregulation yet? So our body, you know, controlling our blood or our body temperature. I believe we did. So one way our cardiovascular system works along with our body temperature is on a really hot day, or if you're exercising hard, your face or hands may get red in appearance. So why this is happening is your blood vessels just under your skin dilate, so that means they widen out some, and so that's creating more blood flow to your skin. That's right, skin dilation, or it's blood vessel dilation near your skin. So when those blood vessels dilate, bringing more blood flow to your skin, it's giving off more heat that way. So that's one way for homeostasis. So by giving off more heat through those dilated blood vessels, our body temperature should come down. And then the opposite is true. If it's really cold outside, those blood vessels constrict so that we have less blood flow to the surface of our skin, so we're going to give off less heat. So we're going to keep more of it to our internal organs where it's most important to have heat. So those are great examples. Heart and Stroke Foundation, if you're looking at more heart health stuff, that's a good place. Any questions or comments on that so far? So that's it for the kind of review on the cardiovascular system. I do have some little bonus questions if you like practice questions. I see someone's typing there. So here is a question. Which of the following is a characteristic of a closed circulatory system, but not an open circulatory system? So which one of these would an open circulatory system not have? So you can click right on the screen to give your answer. So right in the beginning we talked about, you know, how humans have a closed circulatory system, but an invertebrate like a grasshopper would have an open circulatory system. So what was the main difference between the two? Okay, so I have a couple of you answered with the first, which is correct, the first answer. So all of the open and closed, they both have a type of blood. They both have a vascular system and a heart or a pump. But the one difference is an open circulatory system is going to have blood vessels that have a continuous loop, so no breaks. So that's correct. The first answer there is correct. Good job. Let me find my next little practice question. Arteries carry blood away from the heart or blood toward the heart? Okay, so most of you are correct in that arteries carry blood away from the heart. So how I remember that is arteries start with A, away also starts with A. So that's how I remember that arteries carry blood away from the heart. And an important thing to remember is arteries almost always carry oxygen-rich blood, other than that one location, that pulmonary artery that's going away from your heart to your lungs. That's the one artery that's going to have oxygen-poor blood. Right, let me find I think I have one more practice question. Systole, so the higher number in blood pressure, the 120 and 120/80, is equivalent to what action? So what's happening to create that 120 of measured pressure in your arteries? So most of you are correct. So that's the contraction of a heart muscle. So 120 is higher number, so that means higher pressure. And so it is representing the contraction of the heart muscle. So when the heart muscle contracts, it's actually pushing the blood into a new location, like around your body or out to your lungs. And so that is a higher pressure happening. In comparison, the 80 again is that diastolic. So the lower number means that your heart is relaxing and allowing blood flow to come back in. So the answer is the top one. Systole is the contraction of the heart muscle. So good job. All right, do you guys have any questions? Yes, I can see you typing. Yep. You're welcome. So again, I will pre-record for the immune system, and just so that I don't drag this out too long for you guys, because I know our best learning happens in about 45 minutes or less generally, so I don't like to drag out a session over too long. So I will stop recording for this one for now, and then I will post later on today for the immune system. But if you have any questions about anything at all, please use those Q&A boards, or we can have individual Skype sessions one-on-one if you like to review something. So whatever you guys need, I can try to provide it, okay? I'm just going to stop recording now.